we finished off last time discussing marriage, and so let's finish off that topic by talking about divorce. So if you look on page 232 of Universal Ethics, it's chapter 9, you see it discusses the termination of marriage at the top of the page. And again, it's very similar to the creation of marriage, the consummation of a marriage, I guess, in that it's kind of informal. It doesn't require a document or an authority to be present. You know, it's not like you have to have a rabbi or anyone else. It's simply they part ways, but it has to be with a certain permanence to it. So it's kind of, so actually, although the law doesn't require, no high law doesn't require a document, but it seems like if there was one, that would give a great permanence, and it would certainly act as evidence and document the fact that it was a permanent disbandment of the relationship. So the last line of that paragraph, it says it has to be an act taken with the same seriousness of intent as marriage, and so also be publicly known. And so that's why the idea, I mean, it may be actually quite appropriate to have public documentation of the separation in order that it become publicly known. But again, that's not required. But leaving, separating, and moving out, officially moving out. So in other words, that this shows us that for people to break up and remain in the same house together is very problematic, because then there's no public showing of divorce, and that seems to be a prerequisite. So they'd have to move out and not live together anymore. Yeah, I've heard of situation people actually that they get divorced or in the process of divorce, and they live in the same house. That's sounds horrible, crazy idea. Okay, so that's as far as that goes. Now we move on to section D, procreation and parenthood. And this came up, I think someone brought up in the comments on another week, whether or not the mitzvah, the commandment to be fruitful and multiply, it says in Genesis, this applies to the nations as well or not. Of course, the question really, I guess, is on the other foot. Well, wait a minute. This commandment was given to everybody. It was given to Adam and therefore his progeny, and that means all mankind, all human beings. And therefore, what's the question? Of course, the nations are obligated in this mitzvah. But the answer is that, don't forget, is that Noahide law currently, I mean, since the event at Sinai, comes from Moses, was reiterated at Sinai, and was reinstructed at Sinai. And that's what's valid. So the question is, was this mitzvah given to the nations at Sinai? And that, again, that's one of Maimonides' conditions for righteous among the nations, is for them to accept the 7 laws, but not out of their own logic, but because it was given by God to Moses at Sinai. And we've talked about this many times. And it's an incredible thing, because that it equates in a certain sense the 7 laws with the Torah that was given to the Jewish people. It seems like that the prophecy, first of all, was given by the same prophet, so that's obvious. But also seems to imply that the level of prophecy was the level of the giving of the Torah at Sinai, in which God himself, quote, revealed himself. And so that means that we're talking about that the 7 laws are given at an apex prophecy level. So, in other words, the quality of the I think trying to looking for a better word than giving, but the transmission of the Noahide laws the second time was of a higher quality and degree than when it was given to Adam or Noah, because there was a higher level of revelation, a higher level of prophecy. But in any event, the point is that halakhically speaking, be fruitful and multiply, there's a difference of agreement between the rabbis of whether it applies to all the nations or not. So if you look at the bottom of page 232, the last sentence, he says one view is that it was reiterated, and hence these specific requirements are incumbent upon humanity. There's a view that be fruitful and multiply was reiterated at Sinai. Whose view is that? Says Rabbi Chai going in number 165. It's also interesting that the source for this, that the 7 laws needed to be reiterated at Sinai to be binding. You can look at footnote 68. That comes from the Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin, page 59b. On 233, talks about what I told you, that the baseline view is that was not repeated at Sinai. However, there's a general obligation on all mankind deriving from the verse that God did not create the world to be void, but rather to be inhabited. And then he goes on to explain some really interesting things about that. Well, just the depth of this commandment to civilize and what we mean by it. And obviously, what is the repercussions and implications of having children being a means of civilizing the world? Well, it also means that not just bringing them into the world is a mitzvah, because, from be fruitful and multiply, that's just talking about procreation. Once you have kids, you've done it. You were fruitful and multiply. But civilizing is a lot more qualitative, right? I mean, it would mean teaching the children would also be included. To have a proper habitation, it's not enough that we just multiply, but you have to teach, you have to have children that continue. And he goes on to explain this, that the purpose of having the children, according to this, is to perpetuate goodness in the world, and that we transmit these values of the 7 laws to the children, and it continues ad infinitum, their children, etc., people around them, etc. So he says, I think it's a nice paragraph. Maybe we'll read the paragraph on page 233, second paragraph. He says, the significance of the obligation to procreate is to be grasped not simply in the practical sense, that without inhabitants there can be no society, but rather also as a spiritual task. One's purpose is to bring goodness into the world through the fulfillment of the Noahide laws in this world. Consequently, one of the greatest and most fundamental things a person can do is to bring more agents of moral goodness, one's children, whom one will educate to this goal into the world. Page 234 now. When one understands the purpose of life simply as physical and material satisfaction, one could see the multiplication of children as a multiplication of demands on physical resources, and hence a threat to one's own material enjoyment by theirs. On the other hand, when the principal significance of having children is understood as propagating goodness in the world, not strain, but to the contrary, how mutual happiness can result from the multiplication of goodness. So in other words, whether we want children or don't want children is very telling about our very worldview, really the very fundamental way we look at life. Is the purpose of life to have more physical enjoyment and convenience, or do I have a mission to spread good in the world? According to the first approach, a person's not going to want to have kids. If they do have maybe just one, because there's a certain pleasure in having children and, in having progeny, sometimes, particularly women, that there's a very strong, personal drive about that. But they certainly won't have more. They probably won't have more than one. Once they have one and they've already had the experience and they have that companionship and feel like flesh of my flesh, that's about as much inconvenience as they want. Anyway, but without going there, the point is simply that a person who is, kids cause obviously they cost money, time, tremendous amount of effort, and take away from a person's ability to spend time with their spouse or just have their own alone time. So sacrifice, it's a big sacrifice. So if the purpose of life is to enjoy physical enjoyments and convenience, children are burdensome. On the other hand, if there's a mission to bring good into the world, then they're the greatest joy. That's basically kind of what he's saying, I think. But I think it's so fundamental to much else too. When a person, is looking and seeking and judging his life by, how physically sweet it is, and how much entertainment they've had and pleasure and things like that, that's going to be constantly coming up as an obstacle to doing the right things in life, as so many things are difficult and require sacrifice. And this is most of all because it's in your person's personal life. It's not a job. It's not something you do in the synagogue. But having children really, goes to every minute of a person's life. Similar sort of to having a spouse. But obviously even more so. So much time and effort has to go into raising children, especially when they're small. Questions, comments? Okay. But there's also this other point about propagating and multiplying good, and that being the best way, or one of the best ways to do, is having children. Is also very telling and interesting, because you could say, well, I could become a teacher in school, teach other people's kids, and spread goodness that way. I could do a podcast, do a class, do a lecture. Isn't that enough? But evidently it isn't enough. It's not enough. And I think it also goes to the depth of the lesson and the depth of the transmission. To children, when we transmit, it goes so deep, it becomes part of their identity. Even if children sometimes to a certain extent have different ideas than their parents, but what they're taught, remains with them in a very, very deep way, I think. So it's not just quantity, but quality also of the teaching, in terms of, how much it touches a person's heart and is a part of them. And you can do that the most with their own children, really penetrate in a very deep way. Obviously, that requires parents to actually speak to their children and communicate and educate their children. Besides giving them sandwiches and dinner and buying them clothes, they actually have to sit and communicate values to them. So, okay. All right. But I mean, obviously, just in a very simple sense, if younger people don't have children, then they're not going to perpetuate the society. So there is that also just very simple condition and meaning of procreating and getting married, having children, is to continue the society, which is important. And to do that, you have to inculcate a certain loyalty and pride in being part of the society and community and nation, whatever it is.
We don't have that. It's an every man for himself, and people don't care. It becomes very difficult to get people to have children and to want to perpetuate. Okay. Now we're going on to the topic of castration. Exciting topic. Provocative topic, I guess. So the differences of opinion about it. Jews certainly are forbidden to castrate. There's a verse in the Torah about it. I was hoping that they would cite it, but they don't. But the question is, kind of try to find it. I'll look it up. Maybe I'll send it in an email. But it would apply not just to people, but apply also to animals. And there are views that among the authorities that this prohibition is for all humanity. So this is interesting. Actually, this is extremely relevant today with this whole discussion about gender change and that kind of thing. Because according to this, castration, would be forbidden. So I think that would go to some of the things that are going on today. They hear about it in the news. So, okay, this is interesting. It is significant to note that the same authority who is of the view that humanity is prohibited to castrate is also of the opinion that humanity is obliged individually to procreate. Other authorities, whose opinion is the principal one, maintain that humanity is not prohibited to castrate animals or to sterilize humans, and are also of the view that the imperative for humans to procreate is not incumbent upon persons individually, but collectively. All right, so it's a very thin line here, because basically what he's saying is, according to these authorities, humanity as a whole, what he's saying is that an individual has no individual prohibition for castration, but as a community, you can't castrate. So, of course, then it's like, where do you draw the line? Because once you start allowing people to do it, as the numbers start growing, then people won't be able to have children, obviously. So there's a thin balance here between these two opinions. It's not a thin balance. It's a question of, is it something that's being promoted by authorities, institutions, leaders? Then that would fall into even according to this category, because it would be something that's being promoted for the masses. However, although, again, unless it's actually done, it's not that you're actually committing the sin. In other words, if leaders are directing people to castrate, then they would be violating the seventh command, which is to perpetuate to create a judicial system to promote and to police these laws, and they would be doing the opposite. So I think that would be a clear violation, but it wouldn't be actually the violation of castration, since they wouldn't be physically doing it themselves halakhically. But in any event, so what we have here is these two different opinions whether castration is permitted or not, which brings us to the interesting topic of, let's say a Jew owns a pet and wants a pet neutered. So some rabbis will say that bring it to a non-Jewish vet to do it for you, because they're not obligated, they're not prohibited from castration. So that you don't, if it does something needs to be done, you don't do it yourself, you bring it to a non-Jew. We're talking about animals. Okay, so those are the two opinions. Some say that it's forbidden, even for a non-Jew. Some say that it's not forbidden on the individual level, but collectively. Meaning that you can't have a large number of people doing it. So, the difference between these two views also reflects a difference in what it is that halakhically is required. How should I say it? How do we view God's obligatory will upon humanity? Is it that humanity should perpetuate itself as a species? Or even every individual that God brought into the world
needs to try to perpetuate itself. This has come to mind because someone mentioned to me this week that the Lubavitcher Rebbe said that when a person's birthday is a day when God decided that the world can't exist without you, or that the world needs you for a special mission and can't do it without you. So, in other words, according to that approach, that approach really fits in according to the first view, that every individual is forbidden to castrate. The reason would be is that if I have a special individual mission, then I need to perpetuate that mission through my children. Even though their mission will be a little bit different, but it will bear some relevance to mine. I haven't finished, and there's similarities, maybe the personality parts that they have different than mine, but some similarities nevertheless. So they're continuing the story I started. And so if I'm individually important and individually, how do I say, divinely important and needed in terms of the divine scheme, then I shouldn't sabotage that by taking away my ability of having children, and that might also be individuals that are needed in terms of, bringing certain light and purpose into the world. The second view is that, no, that's God's business of how to, fulfill whatever spiritual refinement needs to be, but our requirement is just to perpetuate the species as a whole. So I think that's the way to look at the two opinions. Okay. So there's a nice quote here from Sefer Chinuch, Book of Education, we've spoken about many times. In the next paragraph, so he says, the biological foundation of relationship. Essential to human identity is the knowledge of who one's parents are. Commentary on the biblical prohibition of adultery writes the following. In order that the world should be settled as God desired, God willed that all the entities of his world should produce their offspring, each one according to its kind, and not that one kind should be mixed with another. Similarly, he desired that the offspring of men should be known to whom it relates, and not that one should be mixed with another, as in the confusion of paternity through adultery. Okay.
Rabbi, could I ask a question here?
Yes, please.
We now have genetic testing, and we can determine if we are predisposed to certain illnesses that could be passed on to children. So if I find I have some sort of genetic abnormality that potentially could cause a child of mine to be forced to live through a devastating illness or not have a good quality of life, would that be a valid reason to restrain from having children so as not to potentially pass on something like that?
There's a story that the Talmud relates of King Hezekiah that he saw through, I guess we call it divine spirit, but he saw the future that he was destined to have an evil son. And from that point on, he ceased to be intimate with his wife and to seek to have children. Sometime later, he became deathly ill. And the prophet Isaiah came to him and told him that you're going to die because you have refused to have children. So he told him, but I see in the future that this son is going to be wicked and is going to be an idolater and he's going to lead the children of Israel astray. Isaiah answered him, he said, don't get involved in God's business. It's not your business. Your business is to procreate. That's your command. As far as the future and the fates and so on, that's not your business.
This is the mysteries that belong to God, not to man. Why that God would bring such a person who God knows already that this is going to happen. It's not his concern. So I think there's a relation there between, an analogy between that story and your question, simply because, what could be worse than having a wicked son? Although you could argue that Menashe eventually does repent, so maybe in the end it works out. But I don't have the full answer to it. I don't know if I have like a rabbinic decision on it, but it seems to me that, and from my knowledge of it, in terms of what the Lubavitcher Rebbe would say, would be no, that it's not. First of all, we have to have faith that that won't happen. That's number one. Because we don't know what's going to happen. And number two, it's not our responsibility to worry. That's up to God. It's not up to us. I'll bring you another proof from the Midrash, famous story of Amram during the persecutions in Egypt, right, where there was a decree to throw all the males in the Nile. So our sages say that Yocheved, his daughter, you probably all know this already. I know you're all experts in this stuff. But Yocheved's daughter approached him and said, "You're more wicked than Pharaoh for splitting up with mom and not having any children." And the reason was, and she says, because Pharaoh only decreed on the males and you're decreeing on the females. In other words, you don't know if you're going to have male sons or female daughters. You don't know that. Of course, there was a chance it would be a male son. And that wasn't enough of a reason in her eyes for him to refrain from, being with his wife and bringing children into the world. So again, you see an example of, what could be a better example than that? He'd be risking, if he had sons, that they'd be, small infants would be tortured and drowned and eaten by alligators. And his daughter is still suggesting that he's doing the wrong thing. And he listens.
Well, and Moses would not have come into existence.
Exactly. If he would have thought that, oh man, I could bring, I can't have children because they're going to suffer and I don't want that happening. And if you do the statistics and you do the projections, then, chances are it's 50%, it's not worth it. Then there would be no Moses. Right. So that it kind of answers your question. That's not how Judaism and the Torah looks at children. We don't say, "Oh, I may have a child that's disabled, so let me just not have children." We don't do that. We have to put our trust in God. And I guess also the point is that having children is such a sacred thing. And we're really, in other words, I guess what we're really saying is we're really just God's messengers in a certain sense. And so it's not really for us to make those choices. It's very the opposite of the way modern people look at having children as something really their own, completely their own, meaning completely based on their own self-interest and exactly when it works for them and who it were, it seems like Torah looks at it very, very different, and certainly the Lubavitcher Rebbe looked at it in a very, very different way.